Welcome back, everybody. Today is October the 8th, 2020, and we're going to dig into one of the areas that's caused a lot of confusion, largely because of the messaging around it, and that has to do with transmission of COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and its infectivity. We're looking at the Herbal Database, and I've scrolled down a little ways under the main heading here for COVID. So we're just going to cover this section because in order to know how to prevent it, it's really helpful to know just how it's transmitted. One of the interesting things that came out the other day, October 6th, was that data was looked at from all 50 states and the District of Columbia. They found that 8 weeks after restrictions were lifted or loosened, only 9 of 51 still had low rates of transmission. A clue. Now, some of that is thought to be due to what are called super spreaders. I think the name speaks for itself. It's a generic term for somebody who's just really super contagious. There's no clear definition yet about what qualifies somebody to be a super spreader. Generally, it's someone who spreads it beyond 2 or 3 additional individuals. And as far as the impact of that, there's not quite a consensus yet, but they're beginning to reach a consensus that coronavirus transmission more or less follows the 80-20 Pareto principle. That's a principle that says that 80% of all consequences come from just 20% of the possible causes. So for COVID, that means 80% of new transmissions are caused by fewer than 20% of the carriers. And most people infect very few others or none at all. It's a select minority of individuals who are aggressively spreading the virus. We've got some videos here about the super spreaders. This one is a good one to check out. Super spreading events, high-risk areas, pre-symptomatic spread, test reliability, and President Trump. Apparently, most people who have COVID-19 don't have the virus present in their breath, and those that do are thought to be responsible for being super spreaders. There's a company that makes a weed breathalyzer that did a study on subjects who had tested positive for COVID-19, and about a fourth of those had the virus in their breath. So they're thinking that it may be possible to use this breathalyzer to sort out those who are super spreaders. Earlier in October, researchers wrote in an open letter that the scientific community has to clarify the terminology used to related to aerosols and droplets and employ a more modern size threshold rather than the existing one that's based on 1930s era work. Public health officials should make clear the distinction between droplets ejected by coughing or sneezing, which have inspired the social distancing mantra of 6 feet of separation between people, and aerosols that can carry the virus for a much greater distance. Viruses in aerosols smaller than 100 microns can remain airborne in a confined space for prolonged periods of time and accumulate in poorly ventilated air, leading to transmission. The balance of attention must be shifted to protecting against airborne transmission, said the group. I wonder how many of you know that it can be airborne. That part of the story has been swept under the carpet for a long time, and I was finding research about it all the way back in January. I guess they didn't want to admit it because it's kind of scary. The good news is that the airborne route isn't the predominant route. Just because you've been infected doesn't mean you're going to get seriously ill or ill at all, because there's such a thing as an infectious dose. This has to do with the amount of inoculum that you're exposed to that enters your body. An infectious dose is where 50% of those exposed developed symptoms. This principle of infective dose comes out of pharmacology, where they're testing to find out what an effective dose is, a toxic dose, etc. I'm just going to click on the link to bring that up. There's also a lethal dose. That's the amount of material given all at once that causes the death of 50% of a group of test animals. And that's how they figure out what an effective dose is, a toxic dose, a lethal dose. And while it's used in pharmacology, it also applies to viruses and bacterial doses. With a virus or a bacteria, there is a therapeutic effect at a very low dose. And what that means is, especially in relation to COVID, is that a low dose gives the body time for the immune system to respond effectively. And it acts in such a way that you become more immune to the virus. In fact, you could almost think of it as a vaccination. Because the immune system has been primed, when there's a second dose, the immune system kicks into action very rapidly to help you overcome it. This could also explain what's going on with a lot of the folks who are asymptomatic. They received a low enough dose for their immune system to take care of the situation effectively, whereas high doses can quickly overwhelm the immune system, and that's when folks get really sick. This is the rationale behind wearing masks, which I'm going to cover in another video. So there's a focus on keeping the viral load as low as possible. Higher dose, higher symptoms. Lower dose, lower symptoms, maybe no symptoms. Asymptomatic but still infected. As of September, multiple studies showed that the infection fatality rate is 2 in 1,000 people. Of course, we know it's a lot higher for those over age 70. And in densely populated areas, the infection fatality rate is 5 in 1,000. What about sexual intercourse? Can folks catch it? Okay, so the primary route of transmission is still respiratory. Sweat won't transmit it. Wounds will not transmit. Semen and vaginal secretions don't contain the virus. However, the external anal sphincter will have the virus. So that's what folks need to watch out for. And let's move on to sweat and fecal matter. You may have noticed that a lot of maybe all of the public restrooms are closed. And that may be because the virus is in fecal matter, and flushing the toilet can release the virus into the air. Always, always close the toilet lid before flushing. They've also found it in wastewater. It is a transmission risk. So what does it mean when they say that COVID is aerosolized? This is a good paper. I'm just going to read an excerpt from it. The paper is linked right here. Recognition of aerosol transmission of infectious agents. Although short-range, large droplet transmission is possible for most respiratory infectious agents, deciding on whether the same agent is also airborne has a potentially huge impact on the types and costs of infection control interventions required. And that's probably why there's been so much reluctance to categorize this as an aerosolized agent. The concept and definition of aerosols is discussed in this paper, as is the concept of large droplet transmission and airborne transmission, which is meant by most authors to be synonymous with aerosol transmission, though some use the term to mean either large droplet or aerosol transmission. And that's where a lot of the confusion originates. However, these terms are often used confusingly when discussing specific infection control interventions for individual pathogens that are accepted to be mostly transmitted by the airborne aerosol route. For example, tuberculosis, measles, and chickenpox. So it's important to clarify this terminology where a particular intervention, like the type of personal protective equipment to be used, is deemed adequate to intervene for this potential mode of transmission. For example, at an N95 mask rather than a surgical mask level requirement. With this in mind, this review considered the commonly used term of aerosol transmission in the context of some infectious agents that are well recognized to be transmissible through the airborne route, and other agents like influenza, where the potential for airborne transmission is much more dependent on various host, viral, and environmental factors, and where its potential for aerosol transmission may be underestimated. So that gives us a little bit of background, and you can click on that paper and read it in full. So we have a number of videos and articles here that discuss that this particular virus can be aerosolized. As of July, scientists confirmed that it's aerosolized, calling into question the efficacy of face masks due to the size of the virus being able to pass through material. Previously, it was thought to be carried by small droplets that would be caught on the fabric layer, and of course it does that too. Infectivity has everything to do with viral load, as we've already discussed. The more virus we're exposed to, the more serious the infection. In crowded areas, a face mask still makes sense, since it can lower viral load by catching droplets. We also have to consider the fact that there are multiple strains of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. The one that appears to be predominant now is this D614G. It's a mutation. It's been around for a while, and it is more infective. Unlike earlier versions, it doesn't tend to shed its protein spikes, and that means it has more spikes capable of attaching to ACE2 receptors. However, it does not appear to be more lethal. It is more transmissible, however. Let's move on to seasonal variation. For a while, we were hoping that the warm weather of summer would slow this down. Here are a number of studies and articles that discuss the misconception that seasons are going to be an important factor on the spread of COVID. I think by now, with what we've seen over the summer and then during the winter, what we were seeing in southern hemisphere cases, we know that the seasons don't seem to make a big difference. Here's a paper that came out early on, the role of environmental factors on transmission rates of the COVID-19 outbreak. Previous studies supported an epidemiological hypothesis that cold and dry environments facilitate the survival and spread of droplet-mediated viral diseases, and warm and humid environments see attenuated viral transmission, for example with the influenza. However, the role of temperature and humidity in transmission of COVID-19 has not yet been established. In this paper, they examine the spatial variability of basic reproductive numbers of COVID-19 across provinces and cities in China, and show that environmental variables alone cannot explain this variability. Our findings suggest that changes in weather alone, in other words, increase of temperature and humidity as spring and summer months arrive in the northern hemisphere, will not necessarily lead to declines in case count without the implementation of extensive public health interventions. With influenza season around the corner, there is a possibility some folks could wind up having both influenza and COVID at the same time. Fortunately, a lot of the precautions that are taken for preventing COVID also help to prevent influenza, and a lot of the therapeutics for COVID are effective for influenza, and we'll be getting into that in future videos. Now let's move on to surfaces. It does remain viable on surfaces like plastic and stainless steel for 48 hours, but on cardboard it's only viable for about 24 hours, and then copper for 4 hours. Use caution with objects or surfaces that are possibly contaminated, and of course I think everybody by now already knows to avoid touching doorknobs or elevator buttons with your hands. Scientists have a hard time recovering coronavirus particles from cloth and porous fabrics. The number of viral particles picked up from cloth is 1% of the number picked up from a hard surface. It's thought that the natural fibers break up the droplets in which the virus is suspended, allowing the virus to dry out quickly and die. As for asymptomatic spreaders, the main point here is that infectivity of some asymptomatic carriers might be weak. And then there's more on the multiple strains. I think one point worth mentioning is that this is a positive sense single RNA virus, and those do have a high rate of mutation. It's surrounded by a lipid envelope that's very similar to the phospholipid bilayer of our cell membrane, making it vulnerable to agents that can emulsify fats, for example soaps, and that's why hand washing is so effective. They're fairly fragile compared to other kinds of viruses. In closing, I want to remind those of you who have signed up for the Ultimate Herbal Database to visit the alerts and news section regularly. There's still a lot coming out about this pandemic. The top part stays the same. Those are areas you can go to for updates. And then under the news section, there's some interesting developments popping up here. So stop by here. I change it pretty regularly. In fact, all of it is in flux. In the next video, we're going to dig into prevention a little bit further. This is the area, as you see, prevention. I'm using the scroll bar underneath to scroll through some of the topics. And we are going to take a look at, scroll further, face masks and gloves, as well as vaccines. So please subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. Sign up for the database. Share it. Everyone needs this information. That's why I'm doing this. So thanks again for stopping by, and please leave a comment, and I'd love to get to know who you are. Bye-bye.